Welcome to today's Forgotten Foundations of Fundraising webinar. Our topic today is what differentiates a good fundraiser from a great fundraiser. My name is John Hanna, and I'm the director of the Center for Civil Society. The Center for Civil Society, a project of AmFil, strengthens America's voluntary associations by improving the effectiveness of donors, charitable foundations, and nonprofit organizations. The center fulfills its mission through education, research, publications, webinars like the one we have today, master classes, and in-person events. These resources offer practical advice, ideas, training, and tools that help civil society leaders achieve their missions. Our guests today are Brian Green and Henry Scroop, the co-founders of Northstar Consulting Group, LLC. Northstar brings an unmatched level of attention and expertise to the development and advancement space with the focus on nonprofits, higher education, advocacy campaigns, and philanthropic advising. In addition to helping organizations promote and market their mission, Northstar helps organizations execute a best practice approach to fundraising to help them live their mission to its fullest and create impact in the world. So first up from Northstar, we have Brian Green. Brian brings to Northstar nearly 2 decades of experience in higher education. 10 years were focused on strategic nonprofit fundraising as a former director of development at the University of Notre Dame, with specialized expertise in the Boston, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco metro regions, with an emphasis on financial services, tech, and startup companies. Brian is a graduate of the University of St. Thomas with a BA in theology and the University of Notre Dame with a master's degree in education. Joined with Brian is Henry Scroop. Henry is a managing partner at Northstar Consulting. He has experience in nonprofit fundraising from his over 20-year career at the University of Notre Dame, including 10 as a regional director of development. He has extensive fundraising experience in London and the New York City region, focused on principles in the financial services industry. Henry is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame with a BA in government. So Brian and Henry, it is so great to have you with us today on this Forgotten Foundations of Fundraising series. Should be noted that we were former colleagues at Our Ladies University. I'm really glad to have both of you on the webinar because the two of you are truly two of the best fundraisers I've ever worked with. And I don't just mean that in terms of fundraising success, although you both were incredibly successful as fundraisers, but I also mean the best in terms of how much passion you brought to your fundraising roles and really the highest degree of professionalism. I know how much you love fundraising, and I know how much you loved the donors and individuals and families that you worked with. So again, it's so good to have you both here on the webinar today. Let's just jump into the conversation. We're talking about what differentiates a good fundraiser from a great fundraiser. And hopefully everybody watching, hopefully they want to be great fundraisers. But to start at the beginning and the kind of people that might be great fundraisers, are there specific backgrounds, skill sets, characteristics that suggest that someone could be a great fundraiser? What do you guys think?
Yeah, so I'll just jump in. So thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I hope the numbers didn't dwindle the moment you started reading our bios.
I hope that.
No, we're really grateful, and it's a lot of fun. We're really passionate about this stuff and this idea of if you're going to do it, you should really do it well. And what does that look like? So we're thrilled to have this conversation. So just jumping right in on that. You know, we actually look at this a little bit different. We notice this in a lot of our time, not only at Notre Dame, but a lot of the clients that we work with right now, that they try to really segment who they bring on for talent. And oftentimes there's this thing in the back of everybody's head that we need to have certain sales skills. And so we want a sales background and we really, not that we disagree with that because, you know, there are corollaries, but we really don't see a specific background that becomes important in this. In fact, we've seen the best fundraisers from our experience typically didn't have a sales background, but there were things that were really quite important that led to them becoming really quite great at this work. Henry, you want to go deeper into that?
Sure. I think kind of, you know, we look at Jonathan, first of all, thank you for having us. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. But we think in terms of kind of, somebody who can kind of really develop and kind of understand the mindset of a donor, and kind of and really put themselves in that space and kind of understand the value that they kind of provide in their relationship with the donor. We think that's really kind of very, very important when you think about those skill sets. You can also kind of get into some things like, what, they should be deeply curious and really care about the person they're working with. That's very, very important. And kind of really kind of taking themselves and putting themselves in a very much a relational mentality rather than thinking about transactional relationships. Really kind of the relationship being very paramount to everything that they do in their work with a donor.
And a lot of what I'd add on to that, that's really important that we talk about quite a bit, is the real transition that you want to have happen in these conversations, and the real big difference we see from good fundraisers that really produce and do wonderful things for their organizations to this idea of helping guide transformational giving is a real significant transition that they make of this idea of being across the table from a donor to how do you transition and you are the advocate on the same side of the table as the donor. So it's a real significant pivot in how you think about that work, because it's no longer the donor mindset sort of looking at you, what do they want out of me? And it's a transition into how do we help build a legacy together, and how is this of value to me? And so it really, like a core characteristic that we always talk about is great fundraisers are able to really, truly define the value that they provide to relationships and can articulate it in a way that people buy in, gravitate to it, and it becomes a really pivotal part of a donor's life. What does that look like? It's so easy to say, but little things that become indicators of that happening. They're not just talking to you about supporting your organization. You become a reference point for all the different things that they're thinking about supporting. And what does that look like? You become the barometer or the benchmark of how they filter through sort of the philanthropic life that they have. Just a great indicator that you've made that transition.
That's great. So if it's not squarely certain qualifications or characteristics that make a good fundraiser or a great fundraiser, what would you guys say, or what would the two of you say are maybe things that people could work on to be great fundraisers? I know that the three of us have often in the past talked about the importance of storytelling, and as you just mentioned a moment ago, Brian, about protecting the donor's interests and intent. But what are some qualities or skill sets that anyone can work on to be a truly great fundraiser?
Sure. I think there are things that certain people are going to have, and kind of what sort of donors are actually looking for. And I would think of it in two ways. It's kind of, what ultimately is the donor looking for when they have somebody come in to meet with them or talk with them and represent an organization. And what I would say is kind of, they think in terms of, they want somebody with tremendous integrity. They think about things of like, who do they want to spend time with, and kind of what are the values that they see in those people. They respect and they value timeliness. Think about kind of every time you go in to meet with someone or ask something, you're asking for their time more than anything else. And kind of, so a respect for their time, and kind of when they focus on your organization and what they're looking for, delivering things on a timely basis is extremely, extremely important. And they're looking kind of ultimately that you respect their time, you respect the relationship, you respect the things that they care about. Other things that kind of you can kind of learn, and you did mention kind of, storytelling could be tremendously important and a valuable tool. Protecting the donor's interests, all those things are important. I think they would kind of want a deep understanding of the organization. However, I think a lot of the donors, it's almost implicit. They understand that you're going to have those things. So the kind of those other traits become super, super important.
Yeah, it becomes that discipline, and here's what conveys the passion of what you do, right? How in terms of timeliness, what does that look like? They express an interest in something that's really quite significant at your organization. How timely are you in sort of laying out the difference that particular thing makes, whatever the mission is? How articulate and passionate are you about getting that in front of them? Like, all of it really starts to communicate to the donor. in a really significant way, and forms their impression of the fundraiser, and therefore the value that they provide to them becomes really important. And it's interesting, if you asked a bunch of fundraisers to list the top 3 characteristics that they think lead to being a great fundraiser, and the top 3 characteristics that donors would say, they never match.
Yeah.
Until somebody really elevates to a level where they're not even focused on their fundamental characteristics anymore. So it's so innate that they are so in line and in sync with what the donor would say. Because somebody would say on the fundraiser side, traditionally, hard work, passionate, great storytelling. And on the donor side, it's always honest integrity, timeliness, and respect for my relationship. Like, it's really focused on the practice, and one's really focused on the individual, which is interesting.
Great. We have a lot of people attending today's webinar. If people have questions for Brian and Henry, by all means, you can use the question and answer function, and I'll try to get to as many as I can as we go today. Another question I had for both of you is, I was wondering if you could both share some examples of great storytelling by fundraisers, either some great stories themselves or some tricks and tips about just how to be a good storyteller in general. So any thoughts you have at all, or experiences, or again, stories that you think were told really well?
Yeah, and that one's tricky. I mean, it's a great question, but there's a couple ways that we'll approach it, in the sense that there are, I think the most impactful stories that are told take significant work to build up to the opportunity to share that story at the right time. So it's impactful in the way that you need it to be. And so what does that mean? It means you're listening to the donor, whatever the interactions, even if it's on a first meeting, what have you shared with them to get to a point where they're deeply interested in what's happening at your organization? But usually that doesn't happen necessarily in the first meeting. So what's happened to that point that's built up to this idea that you're going to share something that's really deeply impactful? And that's the great art of figuring out and listening to what someone's keenly interested in, so that you really know sort of what interest points are and what really drives their emotions and therefore their decisions in a lot of that. Henry, I'll share one particular story after Henry, you want to add on to that?
All right. And I think kind of, Brian alludes to kind of, you almost kind of work up to earning the right to tell a story. Yeah. That you kind of develop the type of relationship that it makes sense and they know it's going to provide value. And kind of, you think in terms of guiding principles of kind of, when you think about the story of kind of why should you share something, it should be interesting to them, and that you've kind of developed that understanding that kind of you say, they will have some sort of interest in that. You want it to be timely. It should be related to something kind of going on at your organization, or something that kind of is in the planning process to kind of really kind of set the table for why they should be interested. And kind of, ultimately, you should be asking yourself the whole time, why should someone care? And kind of, and you really kind of, it allows you to kind of not only provide the kind of the narrative around it, but really kind of the vision for the organization and tie those things together.
And so like a good example of how telling a little bit of a story can kind of it's either overcoming sort of an objection that someone might have, or it's painting a kind of a larger picture of the vision. And there's a lot of organizations that have paid attention to Haiti, and it's a wonderful, it's a wonderful, beautiful country with beautiful people. And if you've ever been, you get it. Haiti's the type of place you go to, and it sort of changes your life. It just has an impact on you in a substantial way. It defines need at a whole new level. And we did a lot of work, and a lot of our clients do a lot of work in Haiti. And one of the great challenges that you see is oftentimes donors have an impression that the need is just going to continue. And it's sort of this exhausting moment of like, when does it change? We keep funneling in, what's that change moment so that it becomes more sustainable, and we support other things other than just like basic survival. And so a lot of what we did from a storytelling standpoint was a pivot moment to kind of some of the fundamental challenges. And so the way we would say it is, look, we have to transition a lot of what we do from a support standpoint that obviously takes care of some of basic needs of just staying alive in a lot of situations to some of the fundamentals of nation building. And what does that look like? And so we have to try to kind of create this opportunity where philanthropy starts to play a seed role in providing a more sustainable future. It's not tomorrow, but how do you start laying the bricks today that lead to a better tomorrow? What does that look like? How do you do that? And ultimately, all of that funnels down to how do you invest and build up people? And what does that look like so that they stay? Because that has to trickle into the economy, that has to trickle into business, it touches on a lot of things. But if you're not talking about that, you are just going to continue to funnel money in for basic things. So it's one of those ways where that narrative and telling the story around that starts to paint a larger picture and a larger mosaic of how you're really trying to make a difference, not just serve a meal that day, though that's important.
Great. I believe that you've both mentioned in the past to me, we've talked about the importance of protecting the interest and the intent of the donor. And that's not something that most fundraising professionals talk about frequently. And so my question is, why is that? Are we just busy people by nature? And, fundraising is a very fast-paced line of work. So why don't we talk about that a lot? And, why might we want to discuss that more within the profession? So again, talking about protecting the interest of donors, people in our portfolios, and then also the intent of the donors.
Sure. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's easy to lose focus on that. As a fundraiser, you get pulled in a lot of different directions in an organization. And I think kind of internally, you always are hypersensitive to the needs of the organization. And it's easy to lose sight of the needs of the donor. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why we kind of led with that at the beginning of kind of really kind of providing the value to the donor. No matter what, you can always come back to the priorities, and kind of the magic and the kind of the art of the fundraising is to really kind of take people back and kind of bring them into an organization where they see the kind of the value in their support, the impact their support can have. The challenge becomes is kind of, in those conversations that it's paramount to the relationship for that person would have with the organization, that you kind of keep their intent and their interests really kind of at the forefront, because really things can kind of can get off kilter very quickly. And I think they ultimately lose interest if they feel that you're kind of trying to kind of put your interests and your goals before kind of what's most important to them.
Yeah.
And I would add, specifically, I think anybody that's been in fundraising for a good amount of time, I would say plus 5, 10 years, has had a situation where they forced an ask, or they forced something that you could call it being told to. It was, just such an urgent need, and some of the pre-work that you would normally do didn't kind of go into this, and you made an ask, and it just absolutely, it's worse than hitting a thud at the bottom, because it rolls off the side of the cliff and it drags you with it. That's how bad it can be. And it's happened to me, and it was kind of a very poignant moment that really transitioned my thought on this, that I knew I needed to internally have a very different conversation and take whatever heat was necessary, whatever hand slap was appropriate to protect that relationship, because of what I saw the capacity being, what I saw their interest being, and all this. And and it's a really hard balance between being a great employee, and a team player and everything on the team, and also being very vigilant of protecting the donor. And so that intersection of the role and responsibility you have to protect that relationship, sometimes from the institution that you work for, is a really delicate matter. But it ultimately, I've never seen it not play out in the right way in terms of the relationship and in terms of what it leads to for an organization long term. It can be really, really bumpy in the middle, in that there's the great conviction and passion that you have for the organization and the mission. You're really doing it from a mission standpoint. And that could be hard. Like those can be really challenging conversations internally that leave scars, you know. So you don't want to trivialize this in any sort of way, but it ultimately does lead to a better long-term relationship for the organization.
Yeah. I'd also add if kind of, you know, in a very kind of when you get into very, very specific things and you talk about donor intent, once they make the gift, is actually living up to the actual intent and really kind of executing on it becomes very important. You know, it's one thing to say you have a gift agreement, you have all these things. All of that is great in theory. You have to make sure in practice, the organization is living up to kind of what the intent of the gift was. And if not, you really need to revisit that and kind of talk through that with a donor. And kind of, and sometimes that, you know, you think about kind of the importance of stewardship and kind of in stewarding a gift that's already come in. It becomes really essential that kind of you do that, because there can't be communication gaps. There can't be kind of a misunderstanding, because the longer it goes and it doesn't fulfill the donor's intent, the more challenging the relationship becomes. All of these things you can overcome if there was an issue of kind of a clarification that needs to happen, but really kind of to preserve the relationship, it really does become about the integrity of your organization to truly honor donors' intent.
Great. Next question. So most people fall into fundraising jobs, right? And so by that, I mean, most third graders don't say they want to be a fundraiser when they grow up. You just don't hear that. And, you know, very few students take classes on fundraising or philanthropy at the college level. So what advice do you have for young people who are watching this webinar right now, and they have kind of fallen into fundraising jobs and they're still figuring out if this is the right career fit for them? What would you say to these young people or people transitioning and entering fundraising jobs as maybe a second career?
Yeah, it's I love this one because I think Henry would echo this. You know, both of us, if you'd have asked me 20 years ago, you know, what's development work, I would have assumed something third world. I would think totally. I wouldn't even know. In fact, if you would have said advancement, I would have no clue what that meant. Yet here we are in a reality where we almost see about $1 trillion in the United States alone flow into charitable work and designated as charitable dollars on an annual basis. That's incredible. And usually a person plays a role in that at some point or another. Now, some of that's a little lumpy, you know, and maybe it isn't designated directly to, you know, an organization. They could build a foundation or a donor advised fund. It isn't committed yet. So take those numbers with a grain of salt, but it's still a lot. And it's still really significant. And some of the fundamentals out of that are super important in terms of people oftentimes give to people. You know, the mission plays a very substantial idea and what the organization is trying to accomplish, and the impact obviously plays an enormous role and dictates typically the amount because of the level of impact somebody wants to have. But it shows that relationships matter. And so I only say that because it has become sort of our life work. I wouldn't have known that even 10 years ago. And something how passionate you can become about many different things when you start to realize, you know, the role that you get to play with very interesting people that have done really interesting things in the world that want to have a pivot moment to use their philanthropy for some really great good. And it's intoxicating, to be quite honest, when you have this moment that you've played a really substantial role in creating something that's so impactful, not just for an individual, but for a family, and then for generations of family, where they say things like, this has been the single most important thing that we've done in our life. And it's going to be something that generations of our family are proud of and participate in. I don't know another, I mean, I know there's certainly other industries that you could do that. I won't say this is the only one. This is the only one that I know where it's not defined in, you know, we go to A, B, C, D. It's a little nebulous in the sense that you get to play a very interesting role in people's life. And it looks really kind of fun when you get into it.
That's so great. Thank you for sharing that, Brian. Henry, any thoughts about
Yeah.
people falling into fundraising? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I have a couple of thoughts. Number one, and kind of overarching, you have a more and more challenging world, and kind of with really tremendous issues that you need tremendous organizations to step in and help solve. And basically philanthropy is a huge driver of that, and really kind of allows kind of really some of the worst problems to really be solved. And you allow people to play a role in that through your role as a fundraiser, and really connect them to organizations who have great intent to do great work, but ultimately resources are able to kind of drive and push their work forward. It doesn't happen without those resources. So what you allow people to do is not only kind of accomplish their philanthropic goals, but really kind of allow kind of organizations to live their mission and their vision, and kind of and really have tremendous impact on people. As far as falling into the profession, it's funny. I think people end up where they should end up. And I think kind of like we need to really pivot the kind of the phrasing around that sometimes. If kind of, ultimately it's like nobody does really think about that. You don't say, growing up and going to high school or college that you're going into that profession. What I would say is kind of as you're exploring of where you can have great impact, it opens up those possibilities. And kind of if you're open to that, and you are open to the possibility that you can kind of play that role in people's lives, and in a role with organizations who do great work, it's really something you should consider. Because again, you have to think of, if you're not doing that, and you have some of the attributes and skills and kind of desire to have that impact, who is going to do that? Because it really kind of, it's such a, we need to encourage more people to think about that profession, because you're really kind of doing great work on both sides of the equation, not only with individuals who you work with, but also kind of really kind of with the organization.
That's great. What advice would either of you have for fundraisers that get discouraged? And so even the best fundraisers, they can have a bad quarter, even a bad year sometimes, and they're looking to bounce back. And, I think, again, even the best fundraisers have been in that position. What advice would you have to people who are discouraged and maybe right now not having the best quarter or year?
I think you could always say it's the best quarter, best year, but I mean, on a daily basis, the work could be challenging. And, you think of all the things that go into it. You do tremendous amount of planning. You do all these things to kind of do great work, and kind of, ultimately it's a role that kind of gets measured. You can actually put numbers to it, and which I think becomes hard. I think kind of you have to have a deep faith that you're doing the right things, that the inputs really kind of matter, and that ultimately that will lead to kind of great results. But we've all been in situations there is not a fundraiser that doesn't, that has everything go exactly as they drew up, that everything goes to plan, that everything goes perfectly. We've all kind of planned for kind of our goals for years, and kind of gone into a first meeting and somebody sort of says no. And you say, well, I guess that plan goes out the window, and kind of you refocus. But ultimately, kind of I think you have to have really kind of a tremendous passion for the work, that you can't let yourself get discouraged. You let yourself get discouraged, the work just doesn't happen. You have to have a tremendous aspect of kind of be forward looking, of kind of, optimistic, and kind of about that next conversation could be the pivotal conversation, and very intentional in the work, that kind of, things don't happen by accident when you show up. Showing up is very important. It's important to be in front of people. It's important to have the conversations, but the work needs to become more intentional. How do you kind of help direct conversations and become intentional in the work? And kind of, be flexible, learn how to pivot. We always make, and our plans are all, sometimes it's the best guess and it's the best decision you're making at the time with the inputs that and the things that How do you ultimately kind of gain another piece of information and be able to kind of change up your plan and really kind of keep the relationship, keep all the efforts moving forward?
Yeah, and what I'd add, and it does happen. I mean, we had, with one of our clients, we had a tough conversation that was a bit of a curveball yesterday. It just happens. But focusing on what you do individually, there's a couple different things that I think are super important to think about. You have to control how you think. You just really, really have to control how you think and what's going through your head and not taking everything personally. Now, I say that at the same time when people say, it's not personal, it's business. Actually, I think as a fundraiser in a relational business, it's all personal. It's 100% personal. Like it just is. And to be really great at it, you have to take it really personally. And that authenticity comes through to a donor. So that's talking out of both sides of my mouth a little bit, but you have to be able to shut down and control a narrative, because the biggest person that can influence you is you, because that becomes really important in terms of how that conveys to a donor. You having a tough year really is about your numbers, and probably there's some other things that are going on within an organization that put some pressure on that you bear the weight of. That's hard. That's life, right? That's not specific to fundraising. That's a lot of industry and a lot of careers, and those are tough moments. But in this work, when it's relational, you can't let that be a lead. You can't let that turn into a desperation. You can't let that turn into something that donors feel. The last thing they want to give to is someone, one, that might not be there, but someone that's sort of the Debbie Downer of like, oh, I need it. My numbers really need it. Well, that's not inspiring. That's not why we're asking them to be supportive. They're not giving to keep you in a role. They're giving because they're trying to create a real substantial impact through your organization in the world. And so that's really, really important. And now there's a couple things that you have to make a transition on as you get into that. And one of them is taking what we would call radical responsibility for where relationships are at. And you can't control how a donor thinks. What you have to start looking back, and this is where the diagnosis, you take a relationship, and this is, it's that dark moment where somebody's thrown something at you that's a little different. Now you got to figure out, did I miss something? How did we get here? And this is a great moment of learning and kind of self-awareness, if you will, and where you're at in the job and where you're at in the profession. What should I have asked at different spots when I really go through this? Of the 10 meetings that we've had that led to this point, what should I have asked that flushed this out a little bit more? Where did we become on divergent paths, right? Or how do I get better? Did I not ask for permission at the right time to advance the relationship in such a way that we get to the ask? I already know the answer because they've given me the permission at each step. I already, how do you reflect on that? Because that's what you get to control, right? So controlling a lot of that discouragement is taking ownership of what you can do. And what does that look like? Because it's easy to say that. Well, what does that look like? And the great advice that somebody gave to me, because early on, you're ambitious, you want to make a difference, you want to go, you want to have an impact. So you want to have the numbers. You want the numbers to reflect your intention to like do great things. And somebody always said, the best thing that you can do is just go see other people. Go see more people. If that's what you're concerned about, it means that you don't have enough happening and you're not getting enough meetings. Well, and everybody always says there, well, I'm not getting meetings. Well, that's a different conversation than the other one, because that becomes a conversation of why and what's not being conveyed appropriately or in the right way. So somebody understands the value of sitting down, of why they should sit down with you. How does that add value to their life to have that meeting? That's a different conversation than controlling the discouragement. So it's super important. It's just part of the work. And it's part of what makes it so gratifying when things go really well. And it's one of those things that you see people, it's a breaking point in people's career. They either go this direction and wilt, or they rise to the occasion. So ultimately, it's a very good thing that you have that adversity, because you respond to it or you don't. It sounds harsh, but it's a beautiful thing to be discouraged.
Would you venture to ballpark when that happens for most people in their careers, or is it too hard to ballpark because people are different, organizations are different?
Don't take this as gospel, say, but I think it happens at 2 points. Okay. I think it happens early, and I think it happens at the midpoint. It happens early in organizations because they see other examples, and, an organization will celebrate the successes, and they're like, God, I swear I'm doing everything that they're doing. Why isn't it happening for me? And so that's a moment where you really struggle, because you feel like you're doing everything, but you're still new in it. You're still kind of limping along. A lot of it, I would say, you got to focus on what you bring into the conversations, of how you sort of stack from the very first conversation that you have that sets the tone and expectation of the relationship on both sides to where it goes. And then I think the second one is sort of, not that you can pinpoint how many years is sort of a midpoint in a career, but after somebody feels like they've landed, I've got it, I'm really great, I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, I think I have. And so they back off the gas pedal a little bit, and they have this stall, if you just to put it in, they have this moment where they're not seeing as many people as they were early on. All of a sudden the pipeline isn't as full, and they start saying things like, my portfolio doesn't have the people that can do that. It doesn't, I don't think it can produce in that way. They start making the excuse for the donor before the donor has a chance to really answer it a lot of times. And I think those are the two that we've seen the most of where you see the most discouragement come into kind of the fundraising career. Henry, you may see it differently.
I would just say, I would take the question in a little bit different direction of kind of, when you're new in an organization and kind of, you're doing consistent prep internally and you're armed with all this knowledge, there's always that moment of doubt. And like, until you get out there and actually have the conversation to kind of whether or not this is going to be successful. I mean, you go through an interview process, you do all these things, where the rubber hits the road is, are you able to articulate kind of the mission of the organization? Are you able to kind of make that connection with someone, and walking out of that first meeting and kind of saying, yeah, I can do this because, here are the things that went well. I think kind of when you get into a little bit of a rut or you're discouraged, I think you have to take positives out of individual meetings. And part of that becomes, how do you think about how do you set goals for meetings? And it doesn't mean that you're going to achieve every goal in every meeting, but you start boiling it down of kind of, we go back to basics and we talk about sort of like, this development 101 type of mantra, but really kind of, you should be goal setting. You should be doing preparation to kind of think about, how do I be successful within those goals? If you come out with answers to 2 or 3 goals or move things in a significant way, you have to start celebrating that in your own mind in a lot of ways. And it gets you back in the game. It kind of puts you on the track of saying, I'm going to put this relationship on a path where there's going to be great, tremendous success come out of it. But you have to kind of start getting back to sort of kind of what made you successful before, and really start planning and make it very intentional.
Great advice all around. So one more question for me, and then we'll go to audience questions. Again, if you're with us right now, you can go to the question and answer function in Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Last question that I had, are there any books that either of you would recommend to fundraisers or nonprofit executives?
Yeah, Henry, go for it.
Yeah, I'll start. And I think it's probably a non-traditional book because it's not kind of one that's really kind of widely used in fundraising circles. But the book is Raving Fans by Ken Blanchard. And really kind of, it's really kind of a lot about customer service. And the idea is, and again, this is, where we've all come from different backgrounds and different aspects of different industries. I think if you have a customer service mindset, it'll make sure that you're always thinking about stewardship and kind of the needs of donors in every aspect of your work, and looking at different kind of, parallels on things, because ultimately you're constantly kind of worried about what the relationship is. And kind of, and it's very similar in a lot of ways to industries of kind of when you think about customer service, because if a donor doesn't feel valued, if they don't feel heard, and if they don't feel like that what their intent is really kind of happening, they will seek out other nonprofits that they can be supportive of. Organizations are not entitled to resources from donors. You have to earn it at every step, earn the relationship, earn the next steps in relationship, and ultimately earn the financial support from a relationship. And really kind of keeping stewardship and kind of the customer service mentality really puts those relationships on the right kind of footing.
That's great. Thank you. Brian, any books you'd like to suggest?
Yeah, there's really two that I'd recommend. The first one's this one called Leadership and Self-Deception. It's put out by the Arbinger Institute. I first read this, wow, God, maybe 20 years ago, and I just stumbled upon it. And I can honestly say it was the most impactful book that I've read that shaped how I build relationships in the role that I play in a lot of that. And it's a very conversational book, very similar to the second book that I'll recommend. But I found in this, and here's why I would talk about it from a philanthropy standpoint. And this is why, and the second book is called Crucial Conversations. And I kind of lump both of them together. There has to be a moment where you start to understand how people respond to you, how you start to see yourself with true authenticity, and therefore how others see you. And therefore, like, how does that then work its way into your relationships with family, into business, into friends, and how uncomfortable are you having the conversation that's necessary with yourself and then therefore with others? You know, that, and I would say this from I come from a very large family that has, like most other families, a lot of just dysfunction that's there at all levels, right? So sometimes you get into a spot where you try to avoid the confrontation just to get out of the situation, right? So that was a tendency that I always have, to diffuse and just not let it blow up. So I know that that isn't necessarily the best thing in a lot of this work, because you need to lean in on certain moments, and you have to have a skill set and a mindset that allows you to step into the uncomfortable, to step into the awkward, and make that a very comfortable conversation for you, because those are really important moments as you're building a lot of those relationships. And those two books played an incredible role in me kind of being very aware of my own tendencies, and then being really thoughtful about that, how that became applied in my life. And I would say that's how I went from being, a theology major into a lot of this work, is that I just incorporated that into my teaching first, and then into this with great success. But those are the two most important or most influential ones for me.
That's great. Those are some good reading suggestions for our audience. Okay, questions from the audience. So first up, could you walk through a typical first meeting with a prospective donor?
Oh yeah, so I love this one. I love this one. Henry, you want? I'm happy.
Go ahead, you can start it.
Yeah. So a lot of people say it's the most important meeting. I disagree. I think the second and third meetings are oftentimes the most important, but it's very crucial. Because everything's dependent upon you doing well in the first one in order to get these other ones. But so you have to do a couple different things and set expectations that are really important. So what I oftentimes, if you haven't laid out what your role is, this is the opportunity to do that. And so I think that needs to sound something like this, similar to if I just step in and just do it, I think that'd be easier or better. Is I would say, if it's you, John, the way I work in a lot of this is, I've been asked by XYZ organization to come out and build relationships with individuals that have an interest in our mission and may be interested in being supportive of it at whatever level is appropriate to them. My role is to have that dialogue with you and to really kind of flush out what that interest might be, at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way. But here's my commitment to you in that, is that one of the ways that I want to work through this is to be incredibly thoughtful about what you care about. What I don't care about is just creating some sort of a transactional reality where I'm asking you for whatever dollar and you send it in and it's not connected and it's not something you're really deeply interested in. What I'm not interested in that either. You could do that online. You could do it in a lot of different ways, and it'd be wonderful, and I'd celebrate it. What I'm really passionate about is becoming really involved in a conversation with you about how you can create kind of a really significant moment through our organization and whatever we do in an important way. So my commitment to you is that there'll be no surprises. At no point would I ever make an ask that we haven't discussed or you've given me permission to. And through that, I'd love to lay out different ways that you might be able to be supportive of our organization and unpack larger parts of our mission and areas that you're interested in. And if you're interested in that, I'm all in. If you're not, I would love to know now. And just so we could be very respectful of each other's time and respectful of the mission of the organization more than anything. So that's typically how I would introduce. And that's what, 3-4 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
1 minute tells you everything you need to know if you're going to spend time and invest in this donor, because you've just laid out everything. It's either going to scare them or they lean in and say, I respect that.
Yeah.
It's a process that I want to be part of. And I think it's really important to establish that at the beginning, because now it set the game rules. There's no surprises. You're not coming with an ask next time. So, and this is the big misconception when people don't get meetings, is people have the impression that it's something other than what it is, or maybe it's the right impression. They feel there's a solicitation coming and they don't want to be solicited. So how do you get over that? You tell them what the process is going to be. So that first meeting is important. On top of that, once you establish that, it becomes quite easy. As we train, you need to have 5 things that you know very, very well that are happening at your organization that you think, as you've done research, that person lines up with very, very well. And you're guessing, right? This is your chance because they'll ask after that, well, that's great. Why don't you tell me what's happening at Catholic Medical Mission Board? Why don't you tell me what's and like, what are the interesting things? Well, this is your chance to find out what they're passionate about. So you're ready, like, this is the storytelling a little bit, but you have 5 things that you're ready to fire through. You rarely get to 5 unless, usually you're by third, you're deep in a conversation about what's happening. But you have your pitch of who you are, and then you have the interesting stuff that's happening at the organization that become really, really pivotal in that first meeting.
And I think kind of what you see from what Brian's talking about of kind of this is where the preparation for a meeting comes into play. Like having a kind of somebody, you have to anticipate what you're going to be asked. The ability to introduce yourself, you should be practicing that numerous times before you come in, and actually role playing that with other people and making sure that you are super prepared on that. It shouldn't come across as prepared, but it should be very natural, but you know exactly how you would answer that question. Ultimately, first meetings come down to first impressions, and you have very, very little time to make a first impression. People size you up and kind of make determinations if they want to spend time with you, sometimes within kind of the first seconds of an encounter in an office. And that's how you're dressed, how you carry yourself, and really kind of, do you come in with a degree of confidence and just be able to kind of, they say, okay, this is somebody I would want to work with because they're going to represent me and my interests in the right way.
Yeah.
And, it's that type of kind of setting that tone. Ultimately, in a first meeting, you need to be likable. Should they want to spend time with you? Should they care about the organization? And ultimately, when you leave that first meeting, you should leave with clear expectations about what's going to happen. You're going to define what the follow-up is going to be. And you should also determine, should you guys be meeting again? And that's just kind of get the answer, and kind of where you talk about sometimes the challenge of getting meetings. Go ahead and get that next meeting before you leave the first meeting, that they agree and say, you know what, absolutely, we should get together again. Brian alluded to, and I think kind of, people look at that first meeting being challenging. Now that you've established all those things, how do you differentiate yourself in that second meeting? The second meeting sometimes is 100% more important, because now they've crossed that threshold. Now they will decide whether or not it's worthwhile to kind of invest in a relationship. They're going to give you time is different than them investing in a relationship. That's where you kind of start demonstrating value and providing value into a relationship.
And it's the little things that, and it's perfect that you bring it up in the sense of asking for that next meeting in there. And in that, it's okay for that to be a little uncomfortable. Does it make sense for us to continue to meet? They'll be silent. And usually you always say in this work, let them speak first. I don't at that particular question. I'd say, because what I don't want is to chase and beg you to be, that doesn't feel great to our organization and you care about this work. So you'd want me really focused on building things that are really, really long lasting, and so if you're interested, I'd love to know. Obviously we can figure out timing of schedule, but I really don't want to, be in the situation where I don't know that you're interested in it and sort of begging. You'll get an answer. You'll 100% get an answer. It's a little uncomfortable, but as you get a little bit better at delivering that and you smile, I have this great philosophy that you could almost say anything to anybody as long as you smile. But you'll get an answer. And oftentimes they really appreciate it and respect it because now they know you're very serious. Now they know that you're very deliberate. And most importantly, they know that you're really respectful of your organization. This isn't about you. This is about your mission. This is about you being very, very focused on being great at your job. And so it also tells you they're answering the question of like, well, they, clearly they're so direct on some of this stuff of the important stuff. Other people have gravitated to that because I find myself gravitating to that. So they have other people to go see. This isn't somebody that's begging for meetings. This is someone that's busy. That's what you're trying to convey by being that. And ultimately that's what happens as you really hone that skill down.
That is such great advice all around. Thank you so much for sharing all of those ideas. 2 more audience questions. And so this next one, the question is, if you are working for a very small fundraising shop operation, what would you recommend that a director of advancement focus on or prioritize the most in order to get the most out of relationships with our supporters? So I'm guessing that you could answer this a couple of different ways. You could say, we're going to focus on events. We're going to focus on major gift officers to get quality visits. You could focus on stewardship, cultivation. How would you guys tackle this one, again, for a small fundraising shop?
Sure. Well, I think the key word in there is prioritize.
Yeah.
And thinking about kind of what the goals of the organization are and what your resources are, kind of both from kind of number of people in the shop and goals and what the needs of the organization are. But I think all of these things come down to time. How do you spend your time and does it reflect kind of the best interest of the organization and how you kind of think about timing? Ultimately, you need to kind of spend time with people who can be supportive of the organization and kind of are going to yield the kind of the best resources and kind of ultimately kind of fund the mission. And, you need to think in those terms of kind of who's been engaged, kind of ultimately kind of thinking about things of kind of what their inclination is, what their capacity is. You need to be deeply scheduled in the sense of kind of, and I've said multiple times, being very intentional in the work, especially when you're a small shop, you just can't have missteps. You can't have, missed visits in a sense of kind of that you didn't get something out of it. You have to really kind of be very organized and kind of intentional in your planning. You have to kind of move things. And again, you can't accelerate the relationship. You can't kind of force people to be ready to kind of make a gift. However, you can do things that kind of move them along. You can kind of become prepared to meetings. You can kind of really kind of, as Brian illustrated before, of kind of storytelling and appropriate timing to kind of give material. You can be prepared about kind of what the organization is working on. All of those things become very kind of crucial as far as kind of you think about in a small shop. You also have to decide what you are and structurally what you are. How much of an annual fund campaign do you set up and kind of are you able to kind of capture people and actually capture new prospects on that? Kind of when you kind of think about your major gifts and transformative gifts, you have to think about the time you spend and kind of be super organized. But also what I would say is you think and kind of work backwards. Think about kind of where do you think the appropriate time for the ask is, and think about the number of touches and what those touches must be before you get to that point. And that just helps you become very intentional in the work.
It's great.
Yeah, and what I'd add, and it's hard without knowing a little bit more, is it a small major gift shop and there's an annual fund approach? So let's just assume it's a little bit of you're wearing every single hat in the organization. That's my assumption, just listening to it. And judging from the way that, focus on events, I'm making huge assumptions, and which means I'm probably 1,000% wrong. But, oftentimes, the organization or you're focused around creating a fundraising event. I'm driving to that because that's what's going to bring the most people together. And you spend up a significant amount of time in that. And that can be really important, but every organization that builds around, a primary event thing it's limiting if you don't have an ambition to go beyond that and create an infrastructure to go beyond that. Events become very limiting because it's driven by, there's so many things that are outside of your control, but it's also not a controlled ask that matches the person's capacity. There are too many factors in there that maximize, that allow you not to necessarily maximize what somebody could really, really do for your mission. And so being really thoughtful about what you can create that gives you the opportunity to build the relationship with the people that have the capacity to be really much more significant. And that's really a conversation of how do you capture people that have raised their hand, and what does that look like? Have they given for a number of years to something else that allow you to start getting into a spot where you're making the right ask at the right time for the right amount to build your mission.
That is great. Brian, Henry, thank you so much for spending a full hour with us and talking about what makes a fundraiser great. Can you tell our audience a bit more about Northstar Consulting, what the two of you do and how people can reach you?
Yeah, sure. As we've kind of here, we love this work. So we work with organizations in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different capacities. I think probably the best way to describe this, because you did a great introduction at the beginning, and I won't say that verbatim, is that we try to work with organizations in exactly exactly where they need the most help to be productive. And oftentimes you see organizations really thoughtful about a list of services. Well, we need help with, a campaign. We need help with just this tiny little annual fund. Our approach has been, let's engage, let's look at all of that. And we will sort of be your angel on the shoulder in whatever capacity is necessary to address areas of greatest need for you, so that mission first, resources second becomes a mantra that really builds your mission in a significant way. I know that's vague, but the work is a bit muddled and messy at times. There are a lot of specifics that you could go into in a lot of that, but we work with nonprofits and universities, and also on the philanthropic advising. So we straddle sort of both sides of the giving conversation, helping shape how philanthropists and potential philanthropists think about their giving and how to structure that versus how organizations can really structure and create a way for people to be more effective and efficient in a fundraising operation.
Great. And contact info if people would like to reach out?
Sure. So just emails right now is probably the best. My email is bgreen@nsfundraising.com. And phone number, if you want it, is 574-261-4788. Henry, I'll let you.
And likewise, my email is hsgroup@nsfundraising.com. And my phone number is 574-532-0393.
Thank you both again so much for doing this. Let me plug or promote one more event that we have upcoming here at the Center for Civil Society. In July 10th through the 12th, we will be in beautiful Denver, Colorado for our Major Gifts training seminar. This is a comprehensive introduction to Major Gifts fundraising. If you go to amphil.com and click on events, you can find the registration page there. Again, July 10th through the 12th. We'd love to see you there. We'd love to see your colleagues there. And with that, we will call this one a day. Thank you again, Brian and Henry, for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye now.